You keep betraying yourself without noticing. Here's how to finally stop the betrayal you never saw. There is a moment most people have had but very few have named. You're in a conversation, or a situation, or a relationship, and something inside you becomes very clear, very briefly. A recognition, a signal, something that says without ambiguity, this isn't right, this isn't what you want, this is costing you something. And then, almost before the signal finishes arriving, something else kicks in. The justification, the reframe, the practiced internal voice that explains why the thing you just felt isn't quite accurate, isn't quite fair, isn't quite worth acting on right now. And you override it. You smile or you agree or you say it's fine and you move on. 3 hours later, lying in bed, you can't explain why you feel hollow. That hollowness has a name, and it isn't burnout, and it isn't sadness, and it isn't the result of what the other person did or didn't do. It is the specific accumulated weight of a pattern so familiar it stopped feeling like a choice a long time ago. It is what happens when a person becomes, over years, genuinely skilled at abandoning themselves and genuinely confused about why nothing feels quite real anymore. Here is the part nobody says directly. The most consistent source of betrayal in most people's lives is not another person. It is themselves. Not because they are weak, not because they lack awareness, but because self-betrayal, in its most common and most damaging forms, doesn't look like self-betrayal at all. It looks like being reasonable, flexible, mature. It looks like the behavior of someone who has their emotions under control, who doesn't make a fuss, who considers others before themselves. From the outside, it can look like virtue. From the inside, it feels like slow disappearance. Marcus Aurelius wrote in the Meditations, Book 2, Paragraph 4, that a person does not lose any other life than the one they are living, and does not live any other life than the one they are losing. He was writing about time, but the same precision applies here. Every moment spent overriding your own perception, dismissing your own needs, and performing a version of yourself designed to be palatable rather than real, that moment is not a small thing. It is the actual texture of your life, lived against yourself. In this video, you are going to understand exactly how self-betrayal works. Not the dramatic kind, not the decisions you obviously regret, the invisible kind. The kind that hides inside your best qualities and uses your own intelligence against you. The kind that compounds quietly for years, before the cost becomes impossible to ignore. And more importantly, you are going to understand what it actually takes to stop. Not through willpower, not through self-discipline, through something the Stoics identified 2,000 years ago as the foundation of every other form of genuine freedom. The willingness to be completely, uncomfortably, unflinchingly honest with yourself about what you are actually choosing and why. What you are about to hear may not be easy to sit with, but you have already been living the alternative, and you already know what that costs. You were taught to betray yourself. Nobody decides to stop trusting themselves. It doesn't happen in a single moment, and it doesn't come from a single cause. It accumulates in small, repeated experiences that share the same underlying message. What you feel, what you need, and what you perceive are less important than what the situation requires of you right now. That message rarely arrives as cruelty. More often it arrives as love, as the parent who told you not to cry because it made them uncomfortable, as the household where keeping the peace mattered more than telling the truth, as the early relationships where being agreeable was the price of being accepted, and where expressing a need too clearly or a boundary too firmly produced a withdrawal of warmth that the younger version of you couldn't afford to risk. The nervous system, learning inside those environments, didn't conclude that your needs were wrong. It concluded something more operational, that expressing them was dangerous. That the signal you felt, the discomfort, the reluctance, the clear interior knowing that something wasn't right, was a liability rather than information. And so it learned, gradually and without announcement, to move that signal further from the surface, to process it quietly internally, before it could produce an outward response that might cost something. That is not weakness, that is adaptation. And the mind that learned to do it was doing the only intelligent thing available, surviving an environment where self-expression carried real costs. The problem is that adaptations don't expire when the original environment does. They travel. They apply themselves to new situations, new relationships, new contexts, with the same logic they were built for, regardless of whether the new situation actually requires it. The person who learned that their needs were inconvenient doesn't stop believing that in adulthood. They just become more sophisticated about managing it, more articulate in their justifications, more convincing, to others and to themselves, that the repeated choice to override their own signal is a choice made from maturity rather than from a fear that was installed before they had language to question it. Epictetus addressed this dynamic in the Discourses, Book 2, Chapter 9, where he observed that the person who has been conditioned to live against their own nature does not experience that contradiction as suffering in any obvious sense. They experience it as normal, as the ordinary texture of being a person in the world. And that normalization is precisely what makes it so difficult to see and so costly to sustain. Here is what this looks like in practice. It looks like the person who always volunteers to accommodate, who never seems to have preferences, who says, "whatever you want," with a genuine smile, and then feels vaguely resentful 2 hours later without understanding why. It looks like the one who can articulate everyone else's needs with precision and clarity, but goes genuinely blank when asked what they themselves actually want. It looks like the person who feels most comfortable, most safe, when they are useful, needed, or in service of someone else's agenda rather than their own. The self-betrayal wasn't chosen, but it will continue to be until it's seen for what it actually is. And what it actually is goes deeper than behavior. It goes to something the mind does automatically, below the level of conscious awareness, every time a genuine internal signal arrives. Thirsty Marcus deep in about the voice you learn to silence. It arrives before thought does, before the analysis, before the justification, before the careful weighing of pros and cons. There is a moment of pure interior clarity, a signal that is not constructed, not argued into existence, not the product of any deliberate process. It simply appears with a precision that the subsequent thinking almost never matches. You know the one. The moment you meet someone and something in you registers, without evidence, without explanation, that something is off. The moment you're asked to commit to something, and your body responds before your mind has finished forming the sentence. The moment you're in a room or a conversation or a situation, and a quiet but unmistakable part of you says, "This is not where you belong." And then the thinking starts. And the thinking is very, very good at its job, because the mind that has spent years overriding the internal signal has developed as compensation an extraordinary capacity for rationalization. It can generate plausible explanations for almost any override. It can reframe reluctance as irrationality, discomfort as oversensitivity, and the clear knowledge that something is wrong as mere anxiety to be managed. It does this quickly, fluently, and convincingly. Convincingly enough that the person doing it often cannot tell the difference between genuine reasoning and sophisticated self-deception. This is what makes the pattern so durable. It isn't maintained through ignorance. It is maintained through intelligence, through the remarkable human capacity to construct a coherent narrative around any decision, including the decisions made in service of self-abandonment. Marcus Aurelius returned to this problem repeatedly in the Meditations. In Book 3, paragraph 16, he wrote that the person who does not observe the movements of their own mind must inevitably be unhappy, not as a moral judgment, as a precise observation about mechanism, the movements of the mind, the reflexive overrides, the automatic justifications, the habitual dismissals of the internal signal, operate below conscious attention unless that attention is deliberately directed toward them. And in their absence, they run undisturbed, shaping choices, narrowing options, producing over time a life organized around what is safe rather than what is true. The internal signal that gets overridden isn't always dramatic. Often it's quiet. A slight hesitation before agreeing. A brief flatness after saying yes to something that should feel good. A moment of clarity at 2 in the morning that feels too inconvenient to follow through on in daylight. These small signals are not small. They are the interior's most honest communication, the part of the self that has not yet been trained to perform, that still responds to what is real rather than to what is required. And every time that signal is overridden, not once, not occasionally, but as a consistent pattern across years, something changes in the relationship between the person and their own perception. The signal becomes harder to hear, not because it stops being sent, but because the system learned through repetition that sending it produces no result, that the signal will arrive, be acknowledged briefly, and then be set aside in favor of whatever the external situation seems to demand. Trust, even self-trust, erodes through neglect, and what fills the space it leaves is more dangerous than the original silence. Self-betrayal disguised as virtue. This is the part that makes the pattern so difficult to interrupt, because the behaviors through which most people betray themselves are not the behaviors they feel ashamed of. They are the behaviors they feel proud of, the qualities they list when describing what is best about them, the traits that others consistently praise, that make them reliable and trusted and valued in every room they enter. Patience, generosity, flexibility, humility, the ability to see all sides, the willingness to put others first. These are not small things. They are genuinely valuable human qualities, and in many contexts they represent exactly what they appear to represent: real virtue, real care, real wisdom about when to hold back and when to yield. The problem is that the same behaviors, when they are not expressions of genuine choice but rather automatic responses to the fear of conflict, rejection, or abandonment, are not virtues at all. They are defense mechanisms wearing virtue's clothing. And the person practicing them often cannot feel the difference, because the behavior looks identical from the outside, and because the internal experience of genuine generosity and the internal experience of self-protective appeasement can feel remarkably similar in the moment. Seneca addressed this with uncomfortable precision in his letters to Lucilius, Letter 1, where he observed that the person who belongs to everyone belongs to no one, that the life distributed in all directions, always available, always accommodating, always reorganizing itself around others' needs, is not a generous life. It is a life without a center, and a life without a center is not a life freely chosen. It is a life that has never been fully claimed. Think about the specific texture of this. The person who never says no, not because they don't feel the reluctance, but because the discomfort of saying no exceeds the discomfort of saying yes to something they don't want. The person who is always the one to apologize, not because they are always wrong, but because the silence following unresolved conflict is more threatening to them than the integrity of their own position. The person who makes themselves smaller in rooms where they should be fully present, not from modesty, but from a learned conviction that taking up space is somehow presumptuous. None of these behaviors feel like self-betrayal in the moment. They feel like emotional intelligence, like conflict avoidance, like consideration. The identity built around them is genuinely positive, and that positive identity becomes, paradoxically, one of the primary mechanisms sustaining the pattern. Because questioning the behavior means questioning the identity, and the identity, by this point, has been built carefully enough that dismantling any part of it feels like losing something essential rather than recovering it. This is precisely what Carl Jung described when he wrote about the persona, the constructed social self that begins as adaptation and gradually becomes a cage. The persona isn't false in any simple sense. It contains real qualities, real capabilities, real aspects of the person. But when it becomes the only available self, when the interior life that doesn't fit the persona has been consistently suppressed in its favor, it stops being a social face and becomes a form of self-erasure. The kindness that costs you your honesty is no longer kindness. It is the price of belonging, paid in the currency of yourself. And the accounting, maintained long enough, produces a deficit that no amount of external validation can cover. The cost that accumulates in silence. Self-betrayal doesn't arrive with a clear price tag. That is what makes it so sustainable for so long, and so disorienting when the cost finally becomes undeniable. There is no single moment where the damage is obvious, no dramatic breakdown that can be pointed to as the cause. Just a gradual, barely perceptible erosion that happens below the threshold of what the person is willing to call a problem, because each individual instance is so small, so reasonable, so easily explained away, that naming it feels like an overreaction. But small things compound, and what compounds silently for long enough doesn't stay small. The first thing that erodes is self-trust. Not all at once, in increments. Every time the internal signal is overridden, the gap between what is felt and what is acted upon widens slightly. Every time the perception is dismissed in favor of the external requirement, the interior voice becomes a little less authoritative. And eventually, not through any single decision but through the accumulated weight of 1,000 small ones, the person arrives at a place where they genuinely don't know what they want. Not because they have no preferences, but because the mechanism for registering preferences has been so consistently overruled that it has gone effectively quiet. This is one of the most disorienting experiences a person can have, and one of the least recognized as a symptom of anything specific. They describe it as feeling lost, as not knowing who they are anymore, as having everything they were supposed to want and feeling, inexplicably, nothing much about any of it. Therapy helps sometimes, but it often circles the symptom without reaching the cause, because the cause isn't a single wound. It's a pattern, a practice, a long history of choosing in small moments no one would notice the version of themselves that was least likely to create friction. The second thing that erodes is aliveness. This one is harder to name and easier to explain away as tiredness, as stress, as the ordinary flatness of a demanding life. But it is something more specific than any of those things. It is the specific diminishment that comes from spending years in relationships, situations, and roles that require a performance rather than a presence. From being perpetually slightly elsewhere, not fully in the conversation, not fully in the body, not fully invested in anything, because full investment requires bringing the actual self, and the actual self has learned to stay back. Epictetus described this cost in the Discourses, Book 3, Chapter 1, when he wrote that the person who tries to please everyone has abandoned the only person whose approval is actually within their power to earn. The external validation that self-betrayal is designed to secure never fills the space left by the internal validation it costs. This is the arithmetic that the pattern cannot solve. No matter how much approval arrives from outside, the interior deficit grows in proportion to what was surrendered to obtain it. And there is a third erosion, quieter than the others and more final in its effect. The erosion of the ability to believe that the real self, the unperformed, unmanaged, genuinely present version, is acceptable, is enough, is someone that others would choose if they knew them fully, rather than the version carefully curated for palatability. That belief, once lost, doesn't return through affirmation. It doesn't return through being told you are enough. It returns only one way, through the repeated, uncomfortable, courageous experience of being fully present and discovering that the feared consequence doesn't arrive. That the world and the people in it worth keeping do not require the performance. that the self beneath the accommodation is not the liability it was taught to believe it was. But before that discovery becomes possible, something else has to be confronted, something that the most intelligent people are, paradoxically, least equipped to see in themselves. Why intelligent people betray themselves most. Intelligence is supposed to protect against self-deception. The more clearly a person can think, the more accurately they should be able to see their own patterns, identify their own contradictions, and make choices that genuinely align with what they value. That is the reasonable assumption, and it is almost entirely wrong. The capacity for sophisticated reasoning doesn't reduce self-betrayal. In the specific domain of self-deception, it amplifies it, because the same cognitive ability that allows a person to construct complex arguments, identify nuance, and see situations from multiple angles is the exact ability required to generate a convincing justification for any choice, including choices made in direct contradiction to the person's own values, needs, and perceptions. This is not a small observation. It is the thing that most self-improvement content gets precisely backwards. The assumption that greater awareness automatically produces greater alignment. It doesn't. Greater awareness, without the specific willingness to turn that awareness honestly inward, produces greater sophistication in the construction of self-serving narratives. Smarter people don't betray themselves less. They betray themselves more elegantly, more convincingly, in ways that are harder for others to challenge and harder for themselves to see. Think about what this looks like from the inside. The intelligent person who overrides their instinct doesn't say to themselves, "I am ignoring what I know to be true because facing it is too uncomfortable." They say something that sounds completely different, and that is on its surface reasonable. They say, "I need more information before I can be certain." They say it would be unfair to judge the situation based on one feeling. They say, "I've been wrong about things like this before, so I should be careful not to overreact." Every one of those sentences can be, in the right context, genuinely wise. And in this context, every one of them is a mechanism for delay, for keeping the uncomfortable clarity at a distance until it fades enough to be managed. Marcus Aurelius understood this from within. He was one of the most intellectually capable people of his era, and the Meditations are, among other things, a record of a man actively working against his own capacity for self-justification. In Book 10, paragraph 16, he wrote that it is not enough to think clearly. One must also act in accordance with what the thought reveals, without the gap that clever reasoning is so adept at creating between what is seen and what is done. Carl Jung named the mechanism directly. He called it intellectualization, the use of abstract thinking as a defense against emotional reality. The person who can analyze their patterns with precision but never quite arrives at the moment of actual change, who understands the origin of the behavior, can trace its development, can explain it to others with insight and clarity, and continues it anyway. Because understanding in the absence of honest confrontation is not the same as facing. It is a more sophisticated version of looking away. The uncomfortable truth is this: the person most likely to read a video like this one, to recognize themselves in every example, to nod along with genuine comprehension, is also the person most capable of absorbing the insight completely and using it to continue exactly as before. Not from stubbornness, from the remarkable human ability to make sense of something without allowing it to actually land. Genuine landing requires something intelligence alone cannot provide, and what it requires has been hiding in plain sight inside the oldest philosophical tradition in the Western world. The shadow knows what you pretend not to. There is a part of you that has never been deceived, not by the justifications, not by the reframes, not by the carefully constructed narratives about why what you chose was reasonable, mature, or the only realistic option available. That part registered everything, Every override, every swallowed truth, every moment you looked away from what you clearly saw. It kept the record with absolute precision, in a language that doesn't respond to argument. Carl Jung called this the shadow, not as a metaphor but as a precise description of a psychological reality. The shadow is not the darkness a person is. It is the darkness a person refuses to acknowledge that they are. It is the accumulated content of everything that didn't fit the persona, the needs that were too inconvenient to express, the anger that was too threatening to feel, the desires that contradicted the self-image, the perceptions that were too costly to act on. None of that content disappears when it is rejected. It moves. It settles into the unconscious, where it continues to operate, not as thought but as pattern, as the thing that happens before the person has decided to make it happen. This is why self-betrayal, once established as a pattern, doesn't require conscious maintenance. It runs automatically. The shadow has absorbed the script, has learned through years of repetition exactly when and how the override occurs, and executes it below the threshold of deliberate choice. The person experiences it as instinct, as their natural way of being, as just who they are, but what they are experiencing is not nature. It is accumulated history, operating as though it were nature. Jung observed in his work Psychology and Religion that the shadow grows larger in proportion to how consistently it is denied. The things most aggressively refused acknowledgement don't diminish. They consolidate. They develop in the unconscious a coherence and a force that the conscious personality increasingly cannot account for, which is why the person who is most controlled in their outer life often experiences the most chaotic and inexplicable inner life, because the controlled surface is being maintained at the cost of enormous pressure from everything that was excluded from it. What does this look like in the territory of self-betrayal specifically? It looks like resentment that appears to have no object, a free-floating irritability that attaches to minor things because the major thing it belongs to has never been named. It looks like the chronic low-grade fatigue that isn't physical, the exhaustion of performing a self that requires constant maintenance. It looks like the dreams, the intrusive thoughts, the moments of unexpected grief that arrive in ordinary moments and cannot be connected to anything obvious. The shadow is not subtle in its communication, it is persistent. It uses whatever channel remains available when the conscious mind has blocked all the direct ones. Epictetus wrote, in the Enchiridion, chapter 28, that the person who blames others for their misfortunes is uneducated, but the person who blames neither others nor themselves has begun to receive an education. That distinction is not a call to self-criticism. It is a call to honest observation, to seeing clearly, without the distortion of either defense or attack, what is actually operating. And what is operating in most cases of sustained self-betrayal is not a character flaw. It is an unexamined agreement, made long ago under conditions that no longer exist, that is still being honored long after the circumstances that required it have passed. The shadow doesn't want to destroy you. It wants to be seen. And what it's carrying, what it has been carrying in your place for years, is not as dangerous as the refusal to look. But looking requires something most people have been avoiding even longer than the shadow itself, what Stoicism actually demands of you. There is a version of Stoicism that has become popular, and it is, in almost every important respect, a misreading. It presents Stoicism as a technology for emotional management, a method for staying calm under pressure, for detaching from outcomes, for cultivating the kind of composed exterior that reads in a modern context as psychological strength. In this version, the Stoic practice is essentially one of suppression, of learning to feel less, react less, want less, until the interior becomes quiet enough that nothing can disturb it. This is not Stoicism, it is its opposite. What the Stoics actually demanded, from themselves in their own words, in the private documents and letters they left behind, was not the management of inner experience, but its unflinching examination. Not the quieting of the interior, but the honest interrogation of it. Not the performance of equanimity, but the radical willingness to see without distortion or defense what was actually happening inside, what was actually being chosen, what was actually being avoided, and what the gap between the stated values and the lived behavior actually revealed about the person who claimed to hold them. Marcus Aurelius, in the Meditations, Book 8, paragraph 7, wrote that a person must look inward at what is there, not what they wish were there, not what they believe should be there, but what actually is. He was writing to himself, not as an exercise in self-criticism, but as a discipline of honest perception. The Meditations are not a record of a man who had achieved Stoic mastery. They are the working notes of a man actively daily, refusing to allow himself the comfort of his own self-deception. Every entry is a form of self-confrontation, and the consistency of that confrontation across years is precisely what distinguished his practice from the mere performance of philosophy. Epictetus, who began his life as a slave and built an entire school of thought from inside conditions of radical external constraint, located the highest form of freedom not in circumstance, but in the honesty of one's relationship with oneself. In the Discourses, Book 1, Chapter 1, he identified the one thing that can never be taken from a person, not wealth, not health, not reputation, not freedom of movement, as the capacity to choose how to orient oneself toward what is real. But that capacity, he made clear, is only available to the person willing to face what is real. It is not available to the person curating their perception, managing their awareness, or sustaining the comfortable fiction that they are living in accordance with values they are, in practice, consistently overriding. Seneca put it most directly in Letter 11, where he wrote that the bravest sight in the world is to see a great person struggling with adversity, but that the adversity most worth struggling with is not external. It is the interior condition of a person who has, for whatever reason, stopped being fully honest with themselves about what they are doing and why. This is what Stoicism actually demands, not the suppression of instinct, not the override of emotion, not the performance of indifference. It demands the courage to look directly at what is happening inside you, the real signal beneath the justification, the actual choice beneath the explanation, the genuine self beneath the persona, and to refuse the comfort of looking away. That demand is not comfortable, but it is the only starting point from which anything real can change, the moment you stop pretending. It doesn't arrive as a decision. That is the first thing to understand about the shift that precedes genuine change. It is not a resolution made at a particular moment and executed from that point forward. It is not a commitment or a breakthrough or a dramatic turning point of the kind that makes a coherent story. It is something quieter and in some ways more unsettling than any of those things. It is a moment of recognition that can no longer be fully set aside. You have had versions of it before. The clarity that arrived in the middle of the night, too inconvenient to act on by morning. The moment in a conversation where you saw with sudden precision exactly what you were doing, and then watched yourself continue doing it anyway. The brief undefended seconds between the signal and the justification, when you knew before the knowing was explained away what was actually true. What makes the real moment different isn't the quality of the recognition. It's the absence of the escape. Something has shifted in the tolerance for the familiar discomfort, in the cost-benefit calculation that had always before tipped toward suppression, and the practiced route away from the truth is no longer quite as available as it was. Not because the justifications have stopped arriving. They still arrive on schedule, fluent and plausible as ever, but they land differently. They don't quite close the opening the way they used to. The gap between what is felt and what is acceptable to feel has narrowed to the point where maintaining it requires more than the person is currently able to spend. Marcus Aurelius described this threshold in the Meditations, Book 5, paragraph 9, with characteristic directness. At a certain point, he wrote, a person must decide whether they are going to live the rest of their life as a stranger to themselves or take the trouble of meeting who they actually are. He framed it not as a spiritual event, but as a practical reckoning, the moment a person becomes more tired of the performance than afraid of what genuine presence might cost. That exhaustion is not a weakness, it is information. It is the interior telling you, with the same clarity it has been offering for years, that the current arrangement is no longer sustainable, and that the threat of change, which always seemed larger than the cost of the status quo, has finally been overtaken by reality. What happens in the aftermath of that moment matters enormously, because the recognition alone does not produce change. Recognition is the beginning of a different relationship with the self, not its completion, and the period immediately following is one of the most critical and most vulnerable, because the old patterns remain intact even when the person has begun to see them. The grooves are deep, the reflexes are fast, and the external environment, which has organized itself around the performed version of the person, will not immediately accommodate the emerging one. Epictetus warned about this in the Discourses, Book 2, Chapter 18, that the person who has begun to see their own patterns must expect, for a time, to feel worse rather than better. Because seeing clearly, before the capacity to act clearly has caught up, produces a specific kind of pain. The pain of observing yourself repeat a pattern you now recognize, without yet having built the interior strength to interrupt it consistently. That pain is not failure. It is the friction of genuine change, the cost of finally being present for what has always been happening. And it is, paradoxically, the first sign that something real is beginning. How to finally stop. This is not a list of techniques. What follows is not a protocol or a practice or a set of behavioral modifications that will, if applied consistently, produce a different result. Not because those things are useless, but because the kind of change being described here cannot be installed from the outside in. It has to be built from a different foundation. And the foundation is not discipline, it is not willpower, it is not a better morning routine or a more refined understanding of your attachment style. It is the willingness to honor the signal before the justification arrives. That sounds simpler than it is, because the signal is quiet, and the justification is fast, and the entire history of the pattern is organized around ensuring that the justification always gets there first. But there is a window, brief and easiest to notice in retrospect before it becomes possible to notice in the moment, between the arrival of the signal and the onset of the override. In that window, something is available that rationalization cannot provide, the raw, unprocessed, unjustified truth of what the interior is communicating. Learning to stay in that window, even for a few additional seconds, even imperfectly, even while the justification is already forming, is the beginning of a different relationship with the self. Not because staying in it always produces the right action, but because staying in it repeatedly begins to rebuild something that the pattern eroded, the experience of being a person whose own perception is taken seriously. By themselves, Marcus Aurelius returned to this practice constantly. In Book 4, Paragraph 3 of the Meditations, he described what he called retreat into the self, not as withdrawal from life, but as the regular, disciplined act of returning to the interior and asking honestly, what am I actually choosing here, and does it align with what I actually value? Not what do I wish I were choosing, not what would a reasonable person choose. What am I in this specific moment actually doing? And is that what I would choose if I were being fully honest with myself about what it costs? That question, asked with genuine willingness to hear the answer, is the Stoic practice. It is not dramatic. It does not produce immediate transformation. It produces, over time, the gradual closing of the gap between the person who is performing and the person who is present. And the closing of that gap is what self-trust actually feels like. Not confidence, not certainty, but the specific quiet of a person who is no longer working against themselves. Seneca wrote in Letter 83 that we should live as if everything we do is visible to someone whose respect we would most want to keep. Most people interpret that as an external standard. It isn't. The person whose respect matters most, the only one whose withdrawal of it produces the specific hollowness described at the beginning of this video, is not anyone outside you. It is the version of yourself that still knows beneath every justification what is actually true. Stopping self-betrayal is not a single act. It is a direction. Fair, consistent, imperfect, daily recommitment to the practice of not looking away from what you clearly see, even when what you see is inconvenient, even when honoring it creates friction, even when the version of yourself that needs no accommodation would require others to adjust to something more real and less managed than what they have come to expect. You will not do this perfectly. You will override the signal again. You will find new justifications for old patterns. You will recognize yourself after the fact, doing the thing you understood. That is not failure. That is the actual texture of genuine change, imperfect, recursive, and cumulative, in a direction that only becomes visible over time. What changes is not that the pull towards self-betrayal disappears. What changes is that the gap between the override and the recognition shortens, and then shortens again, until gradually the signal and the response begin to arrive in the same moment, and the person who spent years disappearing inside their own life begins, imperfectly and irreversibly, to show up for it. The person you stopped betraying. What becomes available when self-betrayal ends is not what most people expect. It isn't certainty. It isn't the absence of difficulty, or the resolution of every conflict, or the arrival of a life that finally looks the way it was supposed to. Those things don't come packaged with honesty. Honesty doesn't smooth life out. In some ways, it complicates it, because a person who is no longer willing to manage themselves into palatability takes up more space, creates more friction, and asks more of the relationships and situations that had organized themselves around the managed version. What becomes available is something both simpler and more substantial than any of that. It is the experience of being fully present in your own life, of occupying your own moments rather than hovering slightly outside them, of recognizing with a clarity that doesn't require justification when something is right and when it is not, and of allowing that recognition to actually reach your choices. Marcus Aurelius, in the final entries of the Meditations, did not write about mastery. He wrote about something quieter, the experience of having lived consistently in accordance with his own perception of what was true and what was right, not perfectly, not without failure, but with the kind of recurring honesty that made the failures instructive rather than compounding. He was not describing a destination. He was describing a practice that, sustained over a life, produces something that cannot be obtained any other way. The interior sense of having been, through all of it, genuinely yourself. Epictetus described the endpoint of philosophy not as wisdom, but as freedom. And he was precise about what freedom meant. Not the absence of constraint, not the control of outcomes, not independence from circumstance. Freedom, in his definition, was the condition of the person who no longer requires external validation to know what is true for them, who no longer needs the approval of the room to trust their own perception, who has rebuilt through the patient practice of self-honesty the only foundation on which a life can actually rest, the conviction that what they know, and that it is enough to act on. The most important relationship you will have for the entire duration of your life is not with any other person. It is with the self you either honor or betray, in the thousand small moments no one else will ever see. The quality of that relationship determines, more than any external circumstance, what your life feels like from the inside, whether it feels inhabited or performed, chosen or endured, yours or borrowed from some version of yourself that was built for someone else's comfort. You have already been living the alternative. You already know what the other arrangement costs. And you already have available to you right now the only thing that has ever been required to begin choosing differently: the willingness to stop pretending that you don't know what you know. The Stoics did not promise that this would be easy. They promised something better, that it was possible. That the person on the other side of genuine self-honesty, not perfect, not healed, not beyond struggle, but no longer working against themselves, was reachable from exactly where you are. The only question is whether you are willing to stop betraying that person long enough to let them arrive.